The lights in the hallway flickered softly, casting long shadows across the beige carpet that had seen too many quiet arguments and decisions made behind closed doors. Our modest home in Illinois had always carried the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. Not the kind you appreciate, more like the kind that wraps around your chest and waits for you to notice it's been there too long. My mother's voice echoed from the kitchen, crisp, sharp like the sound of scissors slicing fabric. She was pacing, talking on the phone, probably with Mr. Caldwell, our family's biggest client. The only client, really, who had the power to sway the direction of our entire lives. Mom's business had always been tied to appearances. Our home, our lives, were just another extension of that display. I had just returned from school, backpack still hanging off one shoulder, when I noticed the suit. A dark, pressed navy blue jacket and slacks were neatly laid out on my bed. A matching tie, clip, and black dress shoes completed the set. I didn't ask who put them there. I already knew. Somewhere between pretending not to notice and trying to breathe, I whispered to myself, when did I become a pawn? Dinner that night was served without eye contact. Dad cleared his throat a few times, poking at his plate. My sister, Hannah, sat across from me, quiet, again. Always quiet. Mom broke the silence. So, tomorrow, we're having dinner with the Caldwells. I glanced at the suit still burned into my memory. You'll be helping your father host, she said without looking up. They've heard so much about our son. I froze. My fork hovered midair. I'm not, I started. She cut me off. It's just for one night. You're strong. You'll handle it better than she will. She tilted her head toward Hannah. My sister didn't even flinch. Just kept eating. No defense, no protest. That stung more than Mom's words. I looked at Dad for something, anything. He looked at the salt shaker. I knew what was expected. I was always the one who could adapt. The reliable daughter. The fixer. But this wasn't fixing. Later, I confronted Mom. Why not ask Hannah instead? She folded towels like she was folding away my argument. She's too soft. That word again. Soft. Like weakness. Like failure. You've always been tougher, she added, almost like it was a compliment. But to me, it felt like a curse. In my room, I stared at the suit. Not just a costume, but a declaration. A role assigned, not chosen. They didn't even ask. They just decided. That night, Hannah and I sat across from each other in silence. I was hoping, desperate, for a flicker of outrage, maybe solidarity. She picked at her food without looking up. When we were alone in the hallway, she mumbled, "At least it's not me this time." I blinked. That sentence was louder than any scream. We had both been swallowing things down for years. She disappeared through her door, and I stood there, alone, angry, confused. In the morning, the air felt heavier. I got dressed slowly, piece by piece. Each button on the shirt felt like a betrayal. The tie constricted something far deeper than my neck. Mom walked in without knocking. "Stand like a man," she said, adjusting my shoulders. Dad stood at the doorway. His hands in his pockets. His eyes avoided mine. I turned to the mirror. The person staring back wasn't me. The clothes fit, technically. But they didn't belong to me. I clenched my jaw, trying to steady myself. My eyes burned, not with tears, but with something harder. Dinner came fast. The table was pristine. The Caldwells smiled wide. Mom laughed too loud. Dad nodded too much. I did what was expected. I played the role. The son. He praised my handshake. Said I had presence. Mom beamed. Hannah brought out drinks, barely acknowledged. I excused myself mid-dinner. The guest bathroom was cold, sterile. I locked the door, leaned on the sink. My reflection didn't blink. If I can play the role they want, I whispered, voice calm. I can also choose when to stop. We drove into the city just before dusk. The skyline wore its usual armor of steel and lights, but I barely noticed. My palms were damp, pressed against the fabric of my slacks. Mom sat up front, chatting endlessly with Dad about the reservation, about Mr. Crowsley's assistant, about the valet. She smiled too easily, like she had been rehearsing it for days. Hannah sat beside me in the back, clutching her small purse like it might protect her from the evening ahead. Her fingers fiddled with the zipper, eyes downcast, shoulders tucked inward. When we pulled up, the restaurant's glass facade gleamed in the last light. A man in a suit opened the door for us. Mr. Bragg, the maitre d' asked. Before I could respond, Mom chimed in with a smile. Yes. That's us. She didn't flinch. Didn't correct him. Names have power. And tonight, mine wasn't mine. We were led to a private room where Mr. Crowsley and his assistant were already seated. He stood, arms wide, teeth too white. There he is, he laughed. The son I've heard so much about. He gripped my hand in a firm shake, squeezing like we were already bonded by something I didn't agree to. My mother's face lit up like a Christmas ad. Dad laughed, stiff and shallow. You look sharp, Crowsley said. Carrying the Bragg name, I see. Good shoulders on you. I nodded. My hand trembled as I pulled it back to my side. Mom leaned in, her voice syrupy. He's always been dependable. That word again. We sat. Hannah took the far end of the table, barely noticed. She avoided my eyes. Her silence made more noise in my head than the clinking glasses. Crowsley talked about market trends, legacy, reputation. You know, he said, families like yours, it's rare. Passing the torch. Grooming the next leader. That's how real empires are built. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I was wearing a costume built on lies? Hannah sat still, quiet. I saw the twitch in her cheek. She was biting the inside of her mouth again. I knew that tick. It meant she was counting down until it ended. Then came the wine. The waiter leaned in to pour when his foot slipped slightly. Just a jerk, barely a splash. But the moment the liquid touched the edge of the tablecloth, Mom pounced. Hannah, pay attention. You should have caught that. The table went quiet, but Crowsley chuckled politely. Others followed. That polite kind of laughter that feels more like sandpaper. It wasn't me, Hannah whispered, voice low. No one heard her. Except me. I stared down at my napkin, my knuckles pale around its edge. The napkin tore slightly where my fingers gripped. Humiliation, served family style. Everyone gets a piece. The conversation moved on like nothing happened. Like Hannah didn't just get thrown under the bus for someone else's slip. Crowsley looked at me again. Strong posture. Confident. Your parents raised you right. Mom beamed. He's always had presence. That word. He. Each time it dropped, it didn't bounce, it landed like stone. I smiled. Not because I wanted to. Because I was trained to. Every nod, every compliment felt like a shovel digging me deeper into someone else's story. Hannah excused herself. Checked her phone, said something about a message from work. No one looked up. Except me. Her absence left a hollow at the table that no one noticed. Like she never belonged there in the first place. Dessert came, overly sweet, forgettable. Then Crosley lifted his glass. To the future of the Bragg family business, he toasted. Clinks echoed around the table. Flash from a phone camera. Dad smiled. Mom leaned in. I raised my glass, but it felt like lifting concrete. You're stronger this way, Mom had said earlier. Maybe. Or maybe this was the beginning of something else entirely. Something cracked inside, not loud, but permanent. For once, I didn't feel guilty for being angry. I felt clear. They were all too busy performing to see it. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a case study. A file. Evidence. When we left, the night had gotten colder. Wind bit through the thin fabric of my shirt. I stepped outside and found Hannah near the valet stand. Her arms crossed, eyes red, but her face calm. You looked like you were somewhere else, she said, not looking at me. I paused. Maybe I was. She didn't ask where. She already knew. I turned back to the restaurant. Warm lights glowed behind glass. People inside still smiling. They wanted a son, I whispered. Maybe I'll give them one, just not the one they expect. It started with a favor. Clinton had been with the firm a few years, long enough to know the back hallways and where they kept the things nobody ever talked about. He met me just after sunrise. Downtown was still shaking off its sleep, steam rising from the grates as if the whole city needed to exhale. He flashed his badge, held the door, and nodded. You've got 30 minutes. The archive smelled like dust and legalese. Stale air, thick with the weight of what people hoped would stay buried. Row after row of boxes. No system that made sense. Until I saw it. A brown folder with a red stripe. Bragg Family Legacy, Confidential. The tab was creased, edges curled. My heart started thudding before I touched it. I opened the folder. First page, signature block. Trista Bragg. Michael Bragg. Josephine Bragg. No Raylene. I flipped through shares, trusts, distribution of future earnings. My name wasn't on a single page. Not even as witness. Not even in the fine print. I felt like a ghost reading my own obituary. They wrote a future and carved me out of it. With ink. I didn't even get the courtesy of refusal. By late afternoon, I found myself on the south side, walking up the cracked driveway of our childhood home. Mom wasn't home. Hannah had told me earlier she was out with the ladies from the board. I let myself in. The basement hadn't changed. Smelled like old carpet and rust. Boxes stacked unevenly. School projects, Christmas decorations, forgotten things that used to matter. I found it in a box labeled Office Concepts. A canvas, folded in half. Dusty, one corner torn. My painting. I had done it junior year of high school, an abstract of hands reaching upward, meant for the lobby of the Bragg office. I remembered the night I finished it. Mom had said it was too personal, but she'd keep it. Said she'd think about using it someday. What I didn't know was that it had already been photographed. Trista's name was under it in the firm's 20th anniversary brochure. I sat down on the concrete floor, still holding the edge of the torn canvas. I whispered, "My legacy, hidden in plain sight." No one answered. Just the furnace kicking on, humming like it pitied me. I slid the painting back under the stairs, proof of the ghostwriter behind the image they sold. The next morning, I walked into the Bragg headquarters. I had the folder in my bag. Clinton had printed the entire contract for me, front to back. They'd called a team meeting, something about restructuring and expansion. Mom was already seated, checking her reflection in the silver screen of her phone. "Good morning, Raylene," she said, all syrup. "Ready for the press release?" I sat down across from her. Opened my bag. Pulled out the folder. Slid it across the polished oak. "This has your signature. Dad's. Even Trista's. But not mine." Her smile faltered. Just for a second. Her hand stilled mid-reach. Dad cleared his throat, looked at the ceiling. Trista adjusted her sleeve, eyes never leaving the corner of the table. No one spoke. The contract sat between us, silent but loud. The room felt colder than it should have. I stood. If I'm good enough to wear the suit, I'm good enough to sign the paper. No one stopped me as I walked out. Traffic was brutal. Bumper to bumper all the way back across town. I kept seeing that blank line where my name should have been. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people picture rage. It was quieter. More surgical. I texted Janelle, "I'm done being invisible." She replied instantly. Just a thumbs up. Nothing more. But it felt like someone had seen me for the first time in years. When I got home, I parked in the driveway and stared at the bricks. The same cracks and the same pattern I used to trace with sidewalk chalk. I didn't cry. That night, in my studio, I turned on one light, dim, amber. I pulled out a fresh canvas. Wrote a single word in pencil at the top corner, reclaimed. I wasn't going to burn the past. I was going to frame it. I whispered to no one, I will not let them rewrite my story. Then I picked up the phone. "Clinton? Start pulling everything. I want every signature. Every email. Every memo. If it's got a Bragg name on it, I want a copy." Silence. Then, "You got it." I reached into my bag and laid the folded canvas on the desk. This time, it would stay out in the open. Then my laptop pinged. Subject, urgent meeting, the future of Bragg Inc. I stared at it. Then smiled. The room was small, no windows, just a long metal table and 2 chairs. Clinton Drevens was already seated when I walked in. No smile, just a firm nod like we both knew what this moment meant. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a small black USB drive, and slid it across the table toward me. Nothing dramatic. No speech. No warning. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand like it might burn. He finally said, "It's all there. Everything they didn't want you to see." I plugged it into my laptop. The folder opened like a dam breaking, contracts, internal memos, signature pages, correspondence threads, scanned documents backdated and cross-referenced. Some of it in Mom's hand. Some in Trista's. All with one glaring hole, me. My name wasn't absent by accident. It was erased. Strategically. Repeatedly. And then came the emails. Notes between my mother and their PR manager, referring to protecting the image of the Bragg successor and maintaining the masculine face of the brand. They weren't building a company. They were building a lie, on my back, with my silence. I whispered without looking up, so this is how they built the empire on my name. Clinton didn't speak again. He didn't need to. That evening, I showed up at Bragg Incorporated's gallery launch. New space, big crowd. Faces I hadn't seen in years. People who'd looked past me at every family dinner. Now pretending we were all smiles. I walked through the lobby, into the showcase room. Lights were low, jazz humming from overhead speakers. I grabbed a brochure off a glass table. Page 3. My painting. Acrylic, angular lines, bright red swipes across a dark background. I knew every stroke. I painted it at 19, during a 3-day spiral I never talked about. Labeled, Calwell Design, Artist, Trista Bragg. She stood nearby, laughing with a small circle of board members. One of them complimented her on her early work. She didn't correct them. I didn't interrupt. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't make a scene. I stood still and stared. Pride and betrayal, mixing like oil and water. I walked past the piece, placed the brochure back on the table, and whispered under my breath, they thought I wouldn't notice. I'm just getting started. Later that night, I sent one text to Mom. We need to talk. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. family office. She replied 10 minutes later. Fine. Dress appropriately. Appropriately. Same word she used the day she handed me that suit. I sat at the table for dinner. My sister across from me, still pretending to stir her soup. I said, you saw it too. She didn't look up, just gave the smallest nod. That was all I needed. I stood, left my plate untouched. In the car, the weight hit me hard. Not fear. Not even sadness. Just a final, heavy sort of clarity. I wasn't their contingency plan anymore. Back at my apartment, I pulled out the canvas I'd titled Reclaimed. The new one. Fresh. Untouched. I took a charcoal pencil and drew bold strokes across the top. Truth will be paid for eventually. It wasn't a threat. It was a receipt. I called Janelle. Stay close to your phone. Tomorrow changes everything. She just said, okay. I sat in silence, fingers tracing the edges of the old scarf I used to wear in middle school. One of the only things that ever felt like mine. I didn't sleep much. But I didn't need to. Dawn came like it always does, indifferent. I watched it through the blinds, then got dressed slowly. The suit again, but this time, it didn't wear me. At 7:45, I walked out the door. USB in hand. My story in my pocket. By 8 o'clock, I stepped into the family office. Mom and Dad were seated at the end of the table. Dad in his usual gray blazer, eyes already darting toward the window. Mom had a mug in her hand, not sipping, just holding it like a prop. Trista sat to the side. She didn't smile this time. I placed the USB on the table. No theatrics. Just set it down and looked straight at them. I think it's time you explained why my name isn't here. The room held its breath. Mom's eyes narrowed. Dad cleared his throat but said nothing. Trista's fingers trembled slightly, barely enough to notice, but I did. For a moment, no one spoke. But everything screamed. The sun wasn't up yet when I opened my laptop. The blue glow lit the kitchen like a quiet interrogation room. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but the email header caught my eye. HR announcement, Project Horizon lead, Ray Bragg. Ray Bragg. For a second, I thought it was a typo. Then I scrolled down and saw the attached files. Reports, credit memos, new leadership charts. Every one of them had that name, Ray Bragg. Mine. Except not mine. I clicked open the internal system. My access code still worked. I went straight to the Legacy Documents folder. The title page flashed, Bragg Holdings Future Lineage. And there it was, Trista Calwell, sole heir. Stamped clean across the bottom. No mention of me. Not even a blank space where my name used to be. I sat there, perfectly still. No shaking, no outburst. Just a quiet hum inside my chest, like my body was waiting for permission to feel something. This wasn't a mistake. It was a burial. I remembered that voice in the archive weeks ago, you weren't on the list. It replayed now, sharp as glass. I whispered to the screen, this wasn't oversight. They had erased me on purpose. By late afternoon, the clouds had rolled in, heavy and still. I drove home, half hoping the day would reset somehow. My studio door was open when I arrived. I never leave it open. Something was wrong. The smell hit first, paper smoke. That dry, acid scent that only comes from something personal being burned. Under the desk, a small pile of ash still smoldered. Among it, blackened edges of what used to be my journal, the one I kept through high school, filled with sketches, private thoughts, ideas I never shared. I knelt down and touched one page that had survived halfway. The ink still visible, Raylene, I will use art to speak truth. The edges curled inward, as if the paper itself was trying to hide. In the corner of the room sat Mom's lighter, gold, monogrammed with her initials. She never went anywhere without it. I heard her voice in my head again, we rewrite everything. I stared at the ashes for a long time, the weight of it pressing on my ribs. I wasn't crying. I was emptying. Later, I moved to the living room. Closed the blinds. Sat on the old couch like a stranger in someone else's house. The adrenaline was gone. Just silence left, thick enough to choke on. My phone buzzed. Janelle, you okay? I didn't answer. Across the room, the family portrait hung above the mantel, Mom, Dad, Trista, and me. Except in the latest version, my section had been reprinted after the divorce. The one hanging now didn't include me at all. The frame gleamed gold. The absence was louder than any face could be. I whispered into the room, when did I stop being your daughter? The question hung there with no echo. When night came, I went back to my studio. The air still smelled of burnt paper. I turned on one small lamp. The blank canvas on my easel waited. I didn't paint. I couldn't. I stared at it and thought of something I once read, the best revenge is massive success. Maybe it was true. I reached for the half-burnt page, taped it to the wall above the canvas. The charred words still legible. I'm still here, I said quietly. It wasn't defiance. It was a heartbeat. Days blurred after that. I slept, but not deeply. Ate, but couldn't taste much. The stillness had its own kind of sound, the kind that hums behind everything you've lost. Then, one morning, a white envelope slid through my mail slot. Official stationery. I opened it with a kitchen knife. Board meeting, project launch, June 3rd. Attendance required. I didn't need to read more. I already knew. They were unveiling Trista as the new face of our family's empire. My erasure was complete. I sat at my desk, plugged in the USB Clinton had given me. Every file, every document, every lie ready to expose itself. Not yet. Not on their stage. I looked up at the mirror across from my desk. My reflection stared back, tired, sure. But steady. They want silence, I whispered. I'm preparing sound. It was early morning, the house still silent. I sat at my desk in the studio, the USB by my side, heart beating hard like I was about to bolt. My phone buzzed again. Dozens of notifications. Comments praising my sister, tagging me with words like inept and invisible. I closed my eyes and let it sink in. This was more than business, it was a smear campaign. I opened the metadata. Shell accounts, corporate IP addresses tracing back to the Bragg server. I swallowed. So this has been their play all along, I said to the empty room. I typed a quick message to Janelle, prepare for fallout. My pulse rose and fell in the same breath. Betrayal had a familiar ring, this time, I recognized it clearly. Later, in the studio, I projected screenshot after screenshot onto the wall. Timestamps. IP logs. Emails that read like cold planning. I traced the lines with my finger. As I rehearsed the words I'd deliver in the boardroom, I thought, this isn't a misstep. It's a design. I quoted something once read, the truth always comes out in the end. In the mirror across the room I asked myself softly, how long have you known this was coming? I picked up the white flower Janelle left on my desk, silk bloom, delicate and pure. I pressed it into a binder full of proof. My anger glowed with clarity. I felt vindicated, and still very aware of the risk. By noon, I arrived at the boardroom ahead of schedule. The screens around the table blinked with the internal alert, emergency session. My suit felt heavier than usual. Mom entered, flawless and smiling. I said quietly, let's start with the facts. I laid the USB in front of her. I opened the file and let the room fill with the evidence. Trista turned pale in her seat. Board members shifted, whispering. The air felt thick. I stood steady. Validation. It was making itself visible. A senior board member looked at me and said softly, thank you for bringing this to light. The white flower sat between us on the table, silent but loud. I felt years of shadows lifting. Still, Mom stood across from me, calm and unyielding. I knew I'd won a battle, but the war wasn't over yet. Later, stepping into sunlight, I felt expansion around me. My phone buzzed. Trista resigned from the public-facing role. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. I pocketed the USB and the flower. I whispered to myself, you thought the board was mine. Turns out, I'm holding the remote. The screen glowed with a message from my mother, unopened. I didn't press it. I walked into the building just after 7 hours before the cameras would roll. My suit was pressed, my hair set in a way that looked deliberate. Every movement calculated to feel casual. But inside, my chest was tight. Lights were being tested. Screens flickered. Someone adjusted a floral centerpiece. My mother stood near the side of the stage, clipboard in hand, chatting calmly with a production assistant. She spotted me and gave a polite nod. Trista turned her head, smirked, and went back to her phone. From every angle, I felt them measuring me. Watching. Weighing whether I'd crumble or perform. This was no longer just a gala. It was a test. And I wasn't here to clap politely. The lights dimmed. The host, an executive from a partnering firm, stepped up. Today we unveil the next chapter of Bragg Incorporated, our future led by the visionary daughter of legacy, Trista Caldwell. I stayed seated, chin high, hands clasped. My mother walked out next, microphone in hand, her tone smooth as always. And of course, Raylene Bragg is here to support her sister's journey into leadership. As a family, we are united. I smiled, didn't blink. Applause erupted. I nodded, just enough to look present. My hands rested in my lap, but my fingers brushed the USB drive in my jacket. I knew exactly when I'd use it. But not yet. Halfway through Trista's speech, something shifted. Mom glanced toward the wings and gave a discreet nod. 2 assistants moved in my direction. My pulse slowed. I stood before they reached me. She stepped in, whispering with a steel edge, "Step down, now." Her hand gripped my arm, not tight, but clear. Firm. And the cameras caught it. Flash bulbs went off. I held my posture, allowed them to escort me without resistance. Trista took center stage. I didn't look back. They thought humiliation would silence me. But it only sharpened my focus. I stopped just past the double doors. Clinton stood there. Unmoved. "Raylene," he said, just loud enough. "The board needs to hear your presentation. It's time for both visions to be seen." His voice carried. Behind us, murmurs rose. My mother, just inside the room, turned halfway, expression unreadable. She didn't speak. We walked together toward the boardroom. The space had transformed. Some gala guests had followed out of curiosity. Executives sat straighter. Clinton plugged in the USB as I stepped forward. The screen lit up with the first slide, Future of Bragg, 2 paths. I spoke slowly. You've seen the branding, the headlines. But there's another story behind the curtain. And today, I'm not asking for applause. I'm showing you proof. Mom stayed seated. Trista was nowhere in sight. The slides rolled, altered emails, signature discrepancies, internal decisions made without consent. I paused before each keyframe. Board members leaned in. Eyes darted between the screen and my mother. Her lips stayed parted, but no words came. Silence thickened. A single voice finally spoke. "Why didn't we see this sooner?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "This was your legacy launch," I said. "I just changed the lighting." I walked into the building just after 7 hours before the cameras would roll. My suit was pressed, my hair set in a way that looked deliberate. Every movement calculated to feel casual. But inside, my chest was tight. Lights were being tested. Screens flickered. Someone adjusted a floral centerpiece. My mother stood near the side of the stage, clipboard in hand, chatting calmly with a production assistant. She spotted me and gave a polite nod. Trista turned her head, smirked, and went back to her phone. From every angle, I felt them measuring me. Watching. Weighing whether I'd crumble or perform. This was no longer just a gala. It was a test. And I wasn't here to clap politely. The lights dimmed. The host, an executive from a partnering firm, stepped up. Today we unveil the next chapter of Bragg Incorporated, our future led by the visionary daughter of legacy, Trista Caldwell. I stayed seated, chin high, hands clasped. My mother walked out next, microphone in hand, her tone smooth as always. And of course, Raylene Bragg is here to support her sister's journey into leadership. As a family, we are united. I smiled, didn't blink. Applause erupted. I nodded, just enough to look present. My hands rested in my lap, but my fingers brushed the USB drive in my jacket. I knew exactly when I'd use it. But not yet. Halfway through Trista's speech, something shifted. Mom glanced toward the wings and gave a discreet nod. 2 assistants moved in my direction. My pulse slowed. I stood before they reached me. She stepped in, whispering with a steel edge, "Step down, now." Her hand gripped my arm, not tight, but clear. Firm. And the cameras caught it. Flash bulbs went off. I held my posture, allowed them to escort me without resistance. Trista took center stage. I didn't look back. They thought humiliation would silence me. But it only sharpened my focus. I stopped just past the double doors. Clinton stood there. Unmoved. "Raylene," he said, just loud enough. "The board needs to hear your presentation. It's time for both visions to be seen." His voice carried. Behind us, murmurs rose. My mother, just inside the room, turned halfway, expression unreadable. She didn't speak. We walked together toward the boardroom. The space had transformed. Some gala guests had followed out of curiosity. Executives sat straighter. Clinton plugged in the USB as I stepped forward. The screen lit up with the first slide, "Future of Bragg, 2 paths." I spoke slowly. "You've seen the branding, the headlines. But there's another story behind the curtain. And today, I'm not asking for applause. I'm showing you proof." Mom stayed seated. Trista was nowhere in sight. The slides rolled, altered emails, signature discrepancies, internal decisions made without consent. I paused before each keyframe. Board members leaned in. Eyes darted between the screen and my mother. Her lips stayed parted, but no words came. Silence thickened. A single voice finally spoke. "Why didn't we see this sooner?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. "This was your legacy launch," I said. "I just changed the lighting." I sat cross-legged on the floor of my new apartment, just above the law office I was building from scratch. Sunlight crept in through the window blinds. No furniture yet, just a mattress, a desk, and a quiet I hadn't felt in years. On the wall above the desk, I'd hung one photo, me at 16, paint on my hands, grinning without knowing what was coming. Not a single frame of my parents or the Bragg logo made it through the move. I glanced at the stack of folders beside my laptop. Investors would be arriving soon. The new firm, the new name, it was all real now. Not built from resentment. Not to prove anyone wrong. Just finally, something that was mine. I whispered aloud, "Some roots rot. Others you plant fresh." I slipped the files into my leather tote and grabbed my keys. It was time. The event space was modest. Local press. A few early investors. Mostly faces I'd never seen before, which made it easier. No expectations to defy. No ghosts to dodge. I took the mic without fanfare. "I am Raylene Bragg by birth," I said, my voice steady, but not by business. "Today, I launch True North Legal Solutions." There wasn't applause, just silence, leaning in. "We specialize in helping companies navigate ethical transitions, restructuring without deception. And we do it transparently." A hand rose. Why not just use the brag name? You could cash in on it. I smiled, not smug, genuine. Because truth without legacy still builds trust. But legacy without truth crumbles. The questions kept coming. Serious ones. Legal structure. Philosophy. Risk. I answered every one. Not with slides or slogans, but with experience. The lived kind. I left the podium without handshakes or staged photos. I didn't need them. Backstage, I checked my phone. Missed call. Mom. Again. She hadn't spoken since the boardroom. I didn't expect her to. I didn't want her to. Trista had cried when it fell apart. Clinton had stood still. My name had echoed through that boardroom not as a plea, but a statement. And now, the echo had settled. I muted the phone. Tossed it into my bag. A phrase floated up from memory, something Clinton once said when I was little: some bridges must burn so you can light your way forward. It stayed with me as I walked back to the office that night. 3 days later, an envelope showed up with no return address. Inside, Trista's handwriting. Wobbly, but hers. I didn't know it would go that far, she wrote. I just wanted to be seen. She asked for coffee. Not a meeting. Not a negotiation. Just two sisters. No cameras. No boardroom. I stared at the letter for a long time. Then folded it once. Tucked it into the back of a drawer. My response could wait. Maybe healing wasn't about fixing. Maybe it was about no longer flinching when the past tapped your shoulder. A week passed. I drove to the old house one last time. Let myself in with the key I hadn't used in months. The kitchen was still the same, cinnamon in the air, faint hint of old coffee. I didn't cry. I pulled out a yellow notepad, tore off one sheet, wrote in thick ink. You raised me strong. I chose to be free. I stuck it on the fridge. Didn't knock on her bedroom door. Didn't wait for anyone to come downstairs. I walked out. No dramatic goodbye. Just a step forward. A few months later, I was in my office, mentoring 2 girls from a local high school program. Both sharp, hungry, a little scared. I showed them how to draft a clean contract. Then let them ask anything they wanted. One of them whispered, "How did you get brave enough to do this?" I laughed softly. You don't have to be born brave. You become it. As they left, I watched through the window as they walked to the bus stop, backpack swinging. I turned back just as the new sign was being mounted outside. True North Legal, founder, R. James. My hand brushed over the desk. No rings. No crests. Just the quiet buzz of a printer in the back room. And in my mind, I heard my own voice, clear, calm, and not asking for permission anymore. They gave me a mask. I gave myself a mirror.